Sometimes the moment that changes a man's life does not arrive in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the middle of an airport terminal with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a child crying so hard the entire room turns to stare. Gate B-17 at Chicago O'Hare was crowded with delayed travelers that cold November evening. Coats draped over carry-ons, coffee cups balanced on armrests, phones glowing in tired hands as the loudspeaker crackled every few minutes with another apology for weather delays somewhere along the East Coast. Graham Whitaker stood apart from most of them, tall, composed, his charcoal coat cut with the quiet precision of someone accustomed to private cars and quiet lounges rather than crowded gates. As the CEO of Whitaker Dynamics, a technology firm that had grown from a small startup into a billion-dollar company headquartered downtown, he was used to spaces that bent around his presence. People usually lowered their voices when he walked into a room. Assistants cleared schedules. Doors opened before he reached them. None of that mattered here, because right now the only sound anyone could hear was the wailing of a toddler whose small body shook with sobs near the row of plastic seats by the charging station. The boy could not have been more than 2 years old. His curls were tight and dark, his little sneakers kicking against the polished floor as he cried with the desperate intensity only very young children possess when the world suddenly feels too loud and too unfamiliar. A few passengers glanced over with sympathetic expressions, but most did what travelers usually do in moments like this. They pretended not to see. One woman slipped on headphones. A businessman shifted farther down the bench. The boy's mother stood a few feet away near the counter speaking quietly to the gate agent, her voice calm but urgent as she tried to rebook a missed connection. Her coat was simple but clean, a deep brown wool that matched the quiet steadiness in the way she held herself even as her son cried behind her. Graham noticed the scene the way people notice a flicker of movement in their peripheral vision. At first he intended to walk past it. His phone buzzed in his hand with another message from his assistant about a meeting waiting for him in San Francisco the following morning, and the delayed flight had already turned a manageable travel day into something exhausting. But the sound of the boy crying cut through the terminal again, sharp and breathless, and something about the way the child's small shoulders trembled made Graham stop mid-stride. He hesitated for a second, glancing toward the gate counter where the mother was still talking, then toward the child who now rubbed his eyes with the clumsy fists of someone too young to understand why everything suddenly felt overwhelming. Slowly Graham stepped closer. The people nearby looked up with mild curiosity, probably recognizing his face from business magazines or financial news segments, though none of them said anything. He lowered himself down until he was kneeling at the toddler's level, careful not to move too quickly. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice quieter than the constant hum of the airport. "That's a big cry for such a little traveler." The boy sniffled but did not stop crying immediately. Graham reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones he had been using earlier during the flight delay. They were oversized for a child, but he held them loosely and tapped them once so the soft padding caught the boy's attention. "These help block the loud stuff," he explained in the calm tone adults instinctively use with children. The toddler blinked through watery eyes, curiosity briefly interrupting his distress. Graham carefully placed the headphones over the boy's curls and tapped the side so the gentle hum activated. Then he did something unexpected for a man whose daily routine usually involved negotiations worth millions of dollars. He slowed his breathing deliberately and placed his hand lightly over his own chest. "Watch," he said quietly. "Slow breath in, slow breath out." Children often mirror what they see, and after a moment the toddler's breathing began to match the rhythm Graham demonstrated. The crying softened into hiccups. A few nearby passengers relaxed visibly as the tension in the gate area dissolved. One woman smiled faintly. Another traveler lowered the phone he had been half raising to record the scene. For several seconds, everything grew oddly still, the airport noise fading into the background as the boy's breathing steadied. Then the toddler finally looked up. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected in his wide dark eyes as he studied the stranger kneeling in front of him. And that was the moment Graham Whitaker stopped breathing, because the child's face did not just look familiar. It looked unmistakably, impossibly familiar. The shape of the boy's eyes was the first thing he noticed. The slight curve at the outer corners. Then the line of his eyebrows, the stubborn crease between them even at such a young age. Graham had seen that expression in the mirror almost every morning of his adult life. His mind tried to dismiss the thought immediately. Coincidences happened. Children resembled strangers all the time. But when the toddler tilted his head slightly and frowned in confusion, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. Graham felt something cold, an electric move through his chest. His hand, which had been resting casually on his knee, went completely still. The boy sniffled again, calmer now, and pushed one of the oversized headphone cups aside. "Mama," he asked softly, his voice small and uncertain. The word snapped the moment like a thread breaking. Graham slowly lifted his gaze. The child's mother had turned from the counter and was walking toward them now, her expression changing the instant she saw a stranger kneeling beside her son. She moved quickly but not angrily, her posture protective in the quiet, steady way of someone used to handling life's surprises without panic. When she reached them, she gently lifted the headphones off the boy and gathered him into her arms with practiced ease. Up close, Graham saw her clearly for the first time. Her skin was deep brown and warm under the airport lights, her eyes alert and intelligent as they assessed the situation in one brief glance. "Thank you," she said politely, though her voice carried the cautious edge of a mother who did not yet know whether to trust the stranger who had stepped into her child's space. Graham rose slowly to his feet. For a second, he could not find words at all, because now that the boy was in his mother's arms, the resemblance somehow looked even clearer. The child rested his head against her shoulder, but continued watching Graham with quiet curiosity, the same crease forming again between his brows. Graham felt the strange weight of recognition pressing against his chest. Finally his voice came out lower than he intended. "I'm sorry," he said, still staring at the boy. He just seemed overwhelmed. The mother nodded once. "Airports do that to toddlers," she replied. Her tone was calm, almost neutral, as if she wanted the moment to end quickly. But Graham barely heard the words. His mind was racing through fragments of memory he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. A woman. A summer night in Atlanta. A conversation that ended too abruptly. His throat tightened. The question rose before he could stop it. "Is he?" Graham paused, the words catching in his chest as the realization pressed closer with every second he looked at the child. He swallowed once, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is he mine?" The mother did not look surprised. She simply met his eyes with a quiet steadiness that felt heavier than anger. For a moment the noise of the airport seemed to disappear entirely. Then she answered with a single word spoken as calmly as if she were stating the time of day. "Yes." The word hung in the air between them with a weight that felt heavier than the entire airport terminal. Graham Whitaker did not move for several seconds. The sounds of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and murmuring travelers slowly returned around them. But inside his mind, everything had gone quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. He looked again at the toddler resting in the woman's arms, as if the answer he had just heard might somehow change if he studied the child closely enough. The boy had stopped crying now. The oversized headphones still rested loosely around his small neck, and he watched Graham with the cautious curiosity children often show toward strangers who have suddenly entered their world. That same faint crease between his brows appeared again as he tilted his head slightly, studying Graham with an expression that made the resemblance even harder to ignore. Graham felt a strange tightening in his chest. For years he had managed companies, negotiated acquisitions worth millions of dollars, and spoken confidently in front of rooms full of investors. Yet in this moment, he found himself standing speechless in the middle of Gate B-17, staring at a child who apparently carried his face. The woman holding the boy adjusted her grip slightly and turned her body so the child rested more securely against her shoulder. She did not appear frightened or overwhelmed. If anything, she looked composed in a quiet, deliberate way that suggested she had long ago accepted this truth. Graham finally forced himself to speak. "How old is he?" His voice came out softer than he expected. "2," she replied calmly. 2 years and 4 months. The precision of the answer made something shift uneasily inside Graham's mind. 2 years and 4 months. The number aligned too closely with a memory he had spent a long time trying not to revisit. A memory from Atlanta during a technology conference where a late evening conversation had stretched far longer than expected. The woman standing in front of him now had been there that night. Graham recognized her clearly now that the shock had begun to settle. Imani Reed. She had been working as a consultant on a logistics project for a nonprofit organization that partnered with several of the companies attending the conference. She had spoken confidently about supply chain efficiency, community access to technology, and the importance of ethical leadership in business. Graham remembered being surprised by how easily their conversation had moved beyond work. He remembered walking with her through warm summer air outside the hotel. He remembered laughter, thoughtful questions, and a quiet connection that had felt genuine in a way many of his professional interactions did not. What he did not remember was anything that suggested the story would lead here. Graham's gaze returned to the child. Noah, Imani said softly when she noticed where he was looking. His name is Noah. The toddler shifted slightly in her arms and repeated the word in a small voice as if confirming it. Noah. Graham nodded slowly. The name felt strange and important at the same time. He had built an entire company from an idea in his early 20s, expanded it across multiple states, and navigated markets that shifted constantly with new technology. Yet the possibility that he had a son named Noah was a realization his mind was still struggling to absorb. Why did you not tell me? He asked quietly. Imani did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked a few steps toward the row of chairs near the gate and sat down, settling Noah on her lap, so the child faced outward toward the terminal. She pulled the headphones gently from his neck and placed them in the seat beside her. Noah rested comfortably against her, his small hand gripping the edge of her coat as he watched the movement of travelers passing through the gate area. Only after she was sure the boy was calm did she look back at Graham. You disappeared, she said. Her voice was not angry. It was simply factual. After that conference in Atlanta, you left the next morning. Your assistant told the hotel staff you had meetings in New York. I tried calling once. The number you gave me went straight to voicemail. Graham felt a quiet wave of discomfort move through him. The memory was uncomfortably accurate. The morning after that conference had been chaotic. An unexpected acquisition opportunity had pulled him into back-to-back flights and meetings that stretched across several cities. By the time things slowed down weeks later, the connection from that night in Atlanta had faded into the background of a life that rarely stopped moving. He had not realized how much had changed in the time that followed. I did not know, he said finally. Imani nodded once. I believe you. The simplicity of her response surprised him. There was no accusation in her tone, no bitterness, only a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Noah shifted again, lifting his head slightly as he looked around the busy terminal. His eyes paused on Graham once more. The same curious expression returned, the same faint crease forming between his eyebrows. Graham felt something unfamiliar move through his chest again, something that felt both unsettling and strangely grounding at the same time. Does he know? Graham asked softly. Imani shook her head. He knows that I am his mother and that he is loved. That is enough for a 2-year-old. Graham glanced around the terminal briefly, suddenly aware of how public this conversation had become. Travelers moved past them carrying backpacks and rolling suitcases, unaware that a life-altering conversation was unfolding just a few feet away. Overhead, the loudspeaker crackled again. Attention passengers on Flight 482 to San Francisco. Boarding will begin in approximately 20 minutes. Graham barely heard the announcement. His mind was focused entirely on the small child sitting quietly in Imani's lap. May I sit down? He asked after a moment. Imani studied him briefly, measuring something in his expression. Then she gestured toward the empty chair beside her. Graham lowered himself into the seat carefully, suddenly aware that this moment felt far more significant than any business meeting he had attended that year. Noah glanced sideways at him, still calm. Now that the earlier noise of the airport had faded into the background, Graham rested his hands loosely together, unsure what to do with them. The feeling was unfamiliar. Control had always been one of his strengths. Yet here he was sitting beside a child who had apparently inherited his eyes and his stubborn brow. And for the first time in a long time, Graham Whitaker felt something that resembled uncertainty. Noah leaned slightly toward the headphones sitting on the chair between them and tapped one of the padded cups curiously. Graham picked them up and handed them to him gently. They helped earlier, he said quietly. Noah accepted them with a small nod and placed them around his neck again, mimicking the way he had worn them before. Imani watched the exchange without speaking. After a moment, she said calmly, "The question now is not whether he is yours." Graham looked toward her. Then what is the question? Imani met his eyes steadily. The question, she said, is what you are going to do with the truth now that you know it. For several seconds after Imani spoke, Graham Whitaker did not answer. The question she placed between them felt heavier than anything he had negotiated across a conference table. Around them the airport continued its restless rhythm. Suitcases rolled over polished floors. A child laughed somewhere down the corridor. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal in a voice that sounded both calm and distant. Yet none of those sounds seemed to reach the quiet space forming around the three of them. Graham looked down at the toddler sitting comfortably in Imani's lap. Noah had tilted his head again, the padded headphones resting loosely against his neck as he examined the world with wide, curious eyes. Every few seconds his attention shifted from the passing travelers to the stranger sitting beside him, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had quietly entered his small universe. Graham felt the weight of that gaze more strongly than he expected. What I am going to do, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words for the first time. He rested his hands together, studying the faint reflection of the airport lights on the polished floor. For most of his adult life decisions had been clear. A market shifted. A company needed restructuring. Investors demanded direction. In those moments, he moved quickly and with certainty. But this was not a market decision or a strategy meeting. This was a child who apparently carried his features and his bloodline sitting only a few feet away. Graham finally looked up again. First, he said carefully, I need to understand everything. Imani did not react immediately. She adjusted Noah's jacket slightly and brushed a small curl away from his forehead with a gentle motion that felt practiced and natural. The boy leaned into her touch for a moment before his attention returned to the headphones around his neck. Graham noticed the quiet routine between them, the comfortable rhythm that came from 2 years of shared life. What exactly do you want to understand? She asked calmly. Graham hesitated. When did you find out? He asked. Imani's eyes moved briefly toward the large windows that overlooked the runway. Outside, the evening sky had turned a muted gray-blue as airport lights flickered across the tarmac. About 3 weeks after the conference in Atlanta, she said. I went to a clinic because I had been feeling exhausted and sick. They ran tests. The doctor told me I was pregnant. Graham absorbed the words slowly. 3 weeks after Atlanta. The timeline aligned with the age she had mentioned earlier. Did you ever try to contact me again? He asked. Imani nodded once. I did some research online and found the main office number for your company. Your assistant answered. She was polite, but very clear that your schedule was full for the next several months. She said I could send a message through the corporate email system. Graham frowned slightly. The assistant she referred to had been managing a flood of calls during a complicated merger that year. Did you send the message? He asked. No, Imani replied. Her voice remained calm, but the quiet strength behind it was unmistakable. By that point, I had already started thinking about what kind of life I wanted for my child. I did not want Noah's first connection to his father to begin as a request sent through a corporate email address. Graham felt a faint flush of discomfort rise in his chest. The explanation was simple, but it carried a quiet truth about the way his life had been structured around layers of assistance, schedules, and professional distance. Noah shifted slightly in her lap and reached out toward the headphones again, pressing one of the padded cups against his ear before lowering it again as if experimenting with the sensation. Graham watched the small motion with quiet fascination. The boy's fingers were tiny, but the shape of his hand looked oddly familiar. So you decided to raise him alone, Graham said. I decided to raise him with stability, Imani corrected gently. That meant building a routine where he felt safe and loved every day. I had a steady consulting contract. My parents live about 40 minutes outside the city. They help when I travel for work. Noah has everything he needs. Graham nodded slowly. Except a father. The words slipped out before he could soften them. Imani did not appear offended. Instead, she looked at him with a calm expression that suggested she had already considered the statement many times before. A father is more than a title, she said quietly. It is consistency, presence, responsibility. Graham felt the quiet truth in her words settle heavily in his thoughts. He looked again at Noah, who was now gently tapping the plastic armrest with one of his sneakers while watching a baggage cart roll across the runway outside the window. Does he ask about his father? Graham asked. Imani shook her head slightly. He is 2 years old. At that age, the world is very simple. He knows the people who take care of him. That is enough for now. Another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, reminding passengers that the flight to San Francisco would begin soon. Graham glanced briefly at the gate counter where several travelers had already started forming a line. His assistant would expect him to board shortly. Yet the idea of walking away now felt strangely impossible. "Imani," he said quietly, "I cannot pretend this conversation is easy, but I also cannot pretend it does not matter." She watched him closely, measuring the sincerity behind his words. "What are you asking for?" she said. Graham took a slow breath. For the first time in a long while he allowed himself to speak without calculating how the sentence would sound in a boardroom or a press interview. "I am asking for the chance to be part of his life," he said. Noah turned his head at the sound of Graham's voice. The toddler studied him again with that same thoughtful curiosity. The faint crease returned between his eyebrows, mirroring the exact expression Graham had worn during countless strategy meetings over the years. Imani noticed it too. She exhaled quietly before responding. "You need to understand something," she said. "Noah is not a project you can add to your calendar when it is convenient. Children do not work like business partnerships. They require patience and time." Graham nodded. "I know." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you?" Graham did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked again at the small boy whose life had been unfolding completely outside his awareness for more than 2 years. The thought was both unsettling and strangely grounding. For once, the future he imagined did not involve financial projections or expansion strategies. It involved something far more personal. Finally, he met Imani's eyes again. "I do not know everything yet," he admitted. "But I know I do not want to ignore the truth standing right in front of me." Noah reached out suddenly and touched the sleeve of Graham's coat with his small hand, studying the fabric with quiet interest. The gesture was simple and innocent, yet it felt like the beginning of something neither adult had expected when the evening began. Noah's small fingers rested against the sleeve of Graham Whitaker's coat, as if the fabric itself were an interesting discovery. The toddler rubbed the material between his thumb and forefinger with quiet curiosity, studying the texture the way children often examine unfamiliar objects. Graham did not move. He simply looked down at the tiny hand touching his arm, feeling a strange warmth spread slowly through his chest. For a man who had spent most of his life negotiating contracts and speaking across polished conference tables, the moment felt disarmingly simple and unexpectedly powerful. Across from him, Imani Reed noticed the contact immediately. Her eyes followed Noah's hand for a second, then lifted to Graham's face. She was not smiling, but the guarded tension that had defined her posture earlier had softened slightly. Noah was comfortable. That mattered more to her than anything else happening in the terminal. Around them, the airport continued its constant rhythm. Overhead lights hummed softly. A group of travelers rolled their suitcases past the gate area while checking their boarding passes. The faint scent of coffee drifted from a nearby kiosk. Yet the three of them remained inside a quiet pocket of time that felt strangely separate from the rest of the world. Noah tapped Graham's sleeve once more before looking up at him with open curiosity. His dark eyes were steady, thoughtful in the way young children often appear when they are deciding whether someone belongs in their small circle of trust. Graham noticed again how unmistakably familiar that expression looked. The slight narrowing of the eyes, the thoughtful pause before reacting. He had seen that same look in photographs of himself taken during college debates and early investor meetings. The resemblance was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. "Hi," Graham said gently, lowering his voice to the same calm tone he had used earlier when the child had been crying. Noah blinked once, then gave a soft sound that was somewhere between a greeting and a curious question. The toddler lifted one of the headphone cups again and pressed it against his ear before lowering it, testing the sensation with quiet fascination. Graham felt an unexpected smile touch the corner of his mouth. "They help when things get loud," he explained softly. Noah considered that explanation carefully, then nodded once with the serious concentration of someone absorbing important information. Imani watched the exchange silently. For the first time since their conversation had begun, she leaned back slightly in her seat, instead of remaining forward and alert. The shift was subtle, but it suggested that she was allowing the moment to unfold instead of controlling every part of it. Graham looked toward her briefly. "He seems curious about everything," he said. "He is," she replied. "He likes to understand how things work." Noah turned his head when he heard her voice and leaned comfortably against her arm before glancing back at Graham again. Graham noticed the quiet security in that movement. The child trusted her completely. It was the kind of trust that only grew from thousands of small daily routines. Morning breakfasts, bedtime stories, walks in the park. Graham realized he had missed every one of those moments. The thought settled heavily in his chest. What does he like to do? Graham asked after a moment. Imani answered without hesitation. He loves anything that moves. Cars, trains, airplanes. If something has wheels or wings, he will watch it for 10 minutes straight. As if to confirm her words, Noah suddenly turned toward the large window beside the gate where a baggage cart was slowly crossing the runway. His eyes followed the vehicle with complete concentration. Graham studied the small boy beside him. 2 years of life had passed while Graham had been attending board meetings and reviewing financial reports. 2 years of growth, laughter, and small discoveries that he had never known about until tonight. Does he go to daycare? Graham asked quietly. 3 mornings a week, Imani replied. The rest of the time he is with me or with my parents. Graham nodded slowly. He found himself picturing a small classroom filled with colorful toys, a playground with plastic slides, and a group of toddlers learning to share blocks and crayons. The image felt strangely vivid, even though he had never seen it. Imani, he said after a pause. I know you said earlier that being a father is about consistency. I understand that I have not been part of that until now. She looked at him carefully, waiting for him to continue. But if you allow it, he said, I would like the chance to start learning. Imani did not answer right away. Instead, she watched Noah for several seconds as the boy shifted again and rested his head lightly against her shoulder. His eyelids were beginning to droop slightly, the way they often did when a child had experienced too much excitement during the day. The airport lights reflected softly in his curls. Finally, she looked back at Graham. Learning is not the difficult part, she said. Showing up is. Graham accepted the quiet truth in her words. Then, that is where I begin, he replied. Another boarding announcement echoed through the gate area. Several passengers nearby stood and moved toward the line forming at the counter. Graham glanced briefly toward the gate agent scanning boarding passes. His flight would begin boarding within minutes. The meeting waiting for him across the country suddenly felt far less urgent than it had an hour earlier. Noah lifted his head again and looked toward the movement near the counter. The toddler watched the travelers walking past with sleepy curiosity. Then he turned his attention back to Graham and reached out once more, placing his small hand against Graham's sleeve again as though confirming that the stranger was still there. Graham looked down at the contact and felt the quiet certainty of a realization settling deep inside him. Some decisions in life were complicated. Others became clear in moments like this when a child reached out without hesitation. Graham Whitaker had spent years building a future measured by profit margins and expansion plans. Yet sitting beside Noah Reed in a crowded airport terminal, he understood that the most important future he had just discovered was not listed anywhere on his company calendar. The boarding line near the gate counter continued to grow as travelers stepped forward one by one, scanning their boarding passes beneath the quiet beep of the gate agent's machine. The movement created a slow current of activity across the terminal, yet Graham Whitaker remained seated beside Imani Reed and the small boy whose presence had already changed the direction of his evening. For a moment, Graham simply watched the people preparing to leave for San Francisco. Business travelers adjusted the straps of leather briefcases. A family carefully counted backpacks and jackets before joining the line. The world was continuing exactly as planned for everyone else. But Graham understood that his own plans had already shifted in a way he could not ignore. Noah leaned more heavily against Imani's shoulder now, the earlier curiosity in his eyes beginning to fade into the soft quiet of approaching sleep. The long afternoon of travel delays had clearly worn him down. One small hand still rested loosely against Graham's coat sleeve, as if the toddler had forgotten to remove it while growing drowsy. Graham remained perfectly still so he would not disturb the child. It had been years since anyone had leaned on him with such simple trust. Across from them, the large airport window reflected the glow of runway lights stretching across the evening sky. A plane slowly taxied toward the runway in the distance, its wing lights blinking steadily. Noah noticed the motion and lifted his head slightly, his eyelids heavy but determined not to miss the movement outside. Airplane, he murmured softly. His voice was small but clear. Graham followed the direction of his gaze. Yes, he said gently. That one is heading out soon. Noah watched the aircraft with serious concentration for several seconds before his head settled back against Imani's shoulder again. The effort of staying awake had clearly become too much for him. Imani adjusted her hold, so the boy rested more comfortably against her chest. She spoke quietly so as not to wake him. He usually falls asleep around this time when we travel. Graham nodded slowly. The simplicity of the explanation made the moment feel strangely intimate. It was a small detail from a daily routine that he had never shared before tonight. Where are you headed? He asked softly. Milwaukee, she replied. My parents live there. We were visiting my cousin in Chicago. Graham considered the information carefully. The city was only about 90 miles north of the airport, a short drive compared to the distance he had planned to travel that night. Another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, calling additional rows to begin lining up for the flight to San Francisco. Graham glanced briefly toward the gate counter again. He could easily stand now, walk the short distance to the line, and continue with the schedule waiting for him on the West Coast. Meetings would happen. Investors would ask questions. Presentations would be delivered exactly as planned. But as he looked back at the sleeping child resting against Imani's shoulder, that future suddenly felt strangely distant. Imani, Graham said quietly. She turned her head slightly toward him, careful not to shift Noah too much. Yes. If I board that flight tonight, he said slowly, I will be 3 time zones away by morning. And this conversation will turn into phone calls and scheduled meetings weeks from now. She watched him calmly, saying nothing. Graham exhaled slowly. That does not feel like the right way to begin. Imani studied his face carefully. She had spent years learning how to measure people's intentions, and she was clearly doing so again now. What are you suggesting? She asked. Graham glanced down at Noah once more. The boy's breathing had become slow and even, the steady rhythm of deep sleep settling over him. I am suggesting that I stay, Graham replied. The words sounded simple when spoken out loud, yet they carried a quiet significance Graham had not expected earlier that evening. Imani's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. Stay. Yes. Graham nodded toward the line of passengers boarding the plane. There will be another flight tomorrow morning. But tonight, I would rather not walk away from this moment. For a second, Imani did not respond. She shifted Noah slightly in her arms so the toddler's head rested more comfortably against her shoulder. The boy did not wake. You are a busy man, she said after a moment. That meeting in California must matter. Graham gave a small, thoughtful smile. It does, he admitted. But not more than this. The quiet honesty in his tone hung between them for a few seconds. Around them, the final boarding group began stepping forward to scan their passes. Within minutes, the gate area would empty as passengers moved down the jet bridge toward the waiting aircraft. Imani glanced briefly toward the window again before looking back at Graham. You understand that staying tonight does not mean everything suddenly changes, she said calmly. Noah still has his routine, his daycare, his family. I am careful about who becomes part of his world. Graham nodded immediately. I would expect nothing less. She studied his expression carefully once more. There was no pressure in his voice, no attempt to rush the situation, only a quiet willingness to remain present. Finally, she spoke again. My parents are picking us up outside the terminal in about 40 minutes, she said. They drove down from Milwaukee earlier today. Graham absorbed the information thoughtfully. Would it make you uncomfortable if I walked with you to meet them? Imani did not answer right away. Instead, she looked down at Noah, who was now fully asleep against her shoulder. His small hand had slipped from Graham's sleeve, but still rested loosely near the armrest between them. After several seconds, she nodded once. We will see how the evening unfolds, she said. Graham accepted the cautious answer without hesitation. That is fair. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal. The line of passengers disappeared down the jet bridge one by one until the gate area grew quiet again. Graham remained seated. The flight to San Francisco would leave without him tonight. Yet for the first time since he had entered the airport hours earlier, the direction of his evening felt perfectly clear. The gate area had grown quieter after the last passengers disappeared down the jet bridge. The steady hum of the airport remained, but the urgency of boarding had faded into the background. Workers at the counter began organizing papers and closing computer screens while the glass doors at the end of the jet bridge slowly sealed shut. Graham Whitaker watched the aircraft through the wide terminal window as it pushed away from the gate, its powerful engines beginning a low, steady rumble that vibrated faintly through the floor beneath his shoes. The plane that had been meant to carry him across the country rolled away without him. Yet the decision felt neither reckless nor uncertain. For the first time in many years, Graham had chosen not to follow the schedule that had always controlled every hour of his day. Instead, he remained seated beside Imani Reed and the small sleeping boy who had unknowingly changed the course of his evening. Noah's breathing was slow and even against Imani's shoulder. The toddler's curls rested softly against her coat as she gently supported his weight with both arms. The exhaustion from the long day of travel had finally claimed him completely. Graham noticed how instinctively she adjusted her posture every few seconds to keep the child comfortable without waking him. The movement was quiet and practiced, the kind that came only after hundreds of nights rocking a child to sleep. "He sleeps deeply once he finally settles down," she said softly, noticing Graham watching. "The first 10 minutes are the tricky part. After that, he usually stays asleep through anything." Graham nodded thoughtfully. "He must trust you completely." Imani's expression softened for a moment as she looked down at her son. "Children learn quickly who shows up for them," she replied quietly. The simple sentence carried more meaning than the words themselves suggested. Graham understood the implication immediately. Showing up was not something that could be promised once and forgotten. It had to be proven again and again. A faint vibration came from Graham's coat pocket. His phone screen lit up with several incoming messages from his assistant and the operations director waiting in San Francisco. The subject lines were short and urgent. Flight departure confirmation. Investor meeting update. Request for revised arrival time. Graham glanced at the screen for a moment before locking the phone again and sliding it back into his pocket. For the first time since founding his company, the demands of the business world felt temporarily distant. Imani noticed the movement. "Your office probably expects you to be on that plane right now," she said calmly. "They do," Graham admitted. "But they will survive a delayed meeting." He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the quiet gate area. "The company has hundreds of employees who can handle one evening without me." Imani watched him carefully. "And tomorrow?" she asked. Graham considered the question. "Tomorrow, I will reschedule the meeting for the afternoon. The world of technology will continue moving whether I arrive at 8 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon." A faint hint of amusement touched the corner of Imani's mouth, though her voice remained measured. "That sounds like a significant adjustment for someone who runs a billion-dollar company." Graham gave a small, thoughtful shrug. Sometimes perspective arrives unexpectedly. Noah shifted slightly in his sleep, letting out a soft sigh before settling again against Imani's shoulder. His small hand opened and closed once as though he were still reaching for the headphones he had been playing with earlier. Graham noticed the tiny motion and felt the same quiet sense of connection he had experienced earlier in the evening. The child's presence had begun to feel natural beside him. "How far is Milwaukee from here?" Graham asked after a moment. "About 90 miles, Imani answered. "A little under 2 hours depending on traffic." Graham nodded. "And your parents drove down this afternoon?" "Yes. They are waiting in the short-term parking lot right now." The thought of meeting them settled into Graham's mind with quiet weight. Until a few hours ago, he had not even known Noah existed. Now he was preparing to meet the child's grandparents. The shift in perspective was still remarkable. "What are they like?" he asked. Imani's expression softened slightly. "My father is a retired high school science teacher. My mother works part-time at the local community library. They believe strongly in patience and common sense." Graham smiled faintly. "Those sound like valuable qualities." "They are," she replied. "They helped me raise Noah during the first year when everything was new." Graham nodded slowly. He imagined the grandparents driving across state lines to pick up their daughter and grandson, unaware that the evening had just taken an unexpected turn. The terminal lights reflected softly on the polished floor as an airport cleaning crew rolled a small cart past the gate area. The quiet rhythm of late evening travel had replaced the earlier rush of passengers. "We should probably start heading toward the exit soon," Imani said gently. "My parents will want to get Noah home before it gets too late." Graham stood carefully from his chair so he would not disturb the sleeping child. "Let me carry your bag," he offered. Imani hesitated for a brief moment, before handing him the small travel bag resting beside her seat. Thank you, she said simply. Together, they began walking slowly through the terminal corridor, moving past closed gift shops and quiet seating areas. The soft glow of overhead lights stretched down the hallway as travelers moved toward the baggage claim level. Graham walked beside them, careful to match Imani's pace so the movement would not wake Noah. The toddler slept peacefully against her shoulder, unaware that the world around him had quietly shifted in ways he would one day understand. As they approached the escalator leading down to the arrivals area, Graham felt a steady sense of clarity settle in his mind. Earlier that afternoon, he had entered the airport thinking only about business meetings and flight schedules. Now he was walking toward a parking lot to meet the grandparents of a child he had just discovered was his son. The evening air outside the terminal doors would be colder than the warm interior lights of the airport. But for the first time since hearing the word yes from Imani Reed, Graham Whitaker felt ready to step into whatever came next. The escalator carried them slowly down toward the lower level of the airport, the hum of its metal steps blending with the distant sound of luggage wheels rolling across polished floors. Graham Whitaker stood one step behind Imani Reed so she could balance Noah comfortably in her arms. The toddler remained deeply asleep, his small head resting against her shoulder as if the quiet rhythm of her breathing had become the safest place in the world. Graham held the travel bag she had handed him earlier, the simple canvas strap resting across his hand as they descended toward the arrival level where passengers reunited with family members and rides home waited under the cold evening lights. When they stepped off the escalator, the temperature shifted slightly as the sliding glass doors near the curb opened and closed with each passing traveler. A faint breeze carried the scent of winter air into the terminal. Chicago in late November always had that sharp edge in the atmosphere, the kind that made people pull their coats closer around their shoulders. Outside the wide windows, headlights moved slowly through the pickup lanes while airport security officers directed traffic beneath the glow of tall, overhead lamps. Imani paused briefly near the exit doors, so she could adjust Noah's jacket. The child stirred slightly, but did not wake. Graham noticed the careful way she supported the boy's back while tightening the small zipper on his coat. The gesture was simple, but it reflected the quiet rhythm of someone who had performed the same task hundreds of times. When she finished, she glanced toward Graham. "My parents said they are parked in Section C of the short-term lot," she explained softly. "It is a short walk once we step outside." Graham nodded. "I will carry the bag." Together they moved through the sliding glass doors and into the cool night air. The temperature had dropped into the mid-30s, and a light wind moved across the open lanes where cars waited for arriving passengers. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement from an earlier rain, creating long shimmering streaks beneath the street lamps. Noah shifted again in his sleep as the cold air brushed against his cheek, but he remained wrapped safely in Imani's arms. They crossed the first pickup lane and followed the painted walkway toward the parking structure where rows of vehicles were stacked beneath tall concrete pillars. The echo of footsteps bounced faintly through the open levels of the garage as they walked inside. Imani slowed her pace slightly, careful not to wake Noah as they moved between parked cars. Graham stayed beside her, the quiet seriousness of the moment settling deeper in his thoughts with every step. Somewhere within the parking structure, a car door closed with a soft metallic thud. A moment later, a man's voice called gently from across the row of vehicles. "Imani." She turned immediately toward the sound. Near the far end of the aisle stood an older couple beside a dark blue sedan. The man was tall with silver hair and broad shoulders that hinted at years of physical work before retirement. The woman beside him wore a warm wool coat and held a pair of gloves in her hands. Both of them looked toward Imani with the immediate alertness of people who had been waiting patiently for someone they loved. When they saw the sleeping toddler in her arms, their expressions softened instantly. "There he is," the woman whispered warmly as they approached. "Our little traveler." Imani smiled faintly and stepped closer so they could see Noah without waking him. "He finally fell asleep about 15 minutes ago," she said quietly. The older woman nodded with understanding. "Long day for such a small boy." The man's eyes then moved toward Graham, noticing the unfamiliar figure standing beside his daughter with the travel bag in hand. His expression shifted slightly from warmth to careful curiosity. "Imani," he said gently, "you have company." Imani took a calm breath before responding. "Dad, Mom." This is Graham Whitaker." The name hung in the cool air of the parking garage for a brief moment. Graham stepped forward slightly and extended his hand respectfully. "It is nice to meet you," he said. The older man accepted the handshake after a short pause. His grip was firm, the kind that came from years of teaching students and building practical things around the house. "David Reed," he replied. Then he gestured toward the woman beside him. "And this is my wife, Linda." Linda Reed gave Graham a polite nod, though her eyes moved thoughtfully between him and the sleeping child in Imani's arms. She clearly sensed that something more complicated than a routine airport pickup had unfolded during the evening. "It is good to meet you," she said kindly. "Thank you for helping Imani with the luggage." Graham glanced briefly toward Imani before answering. "I am glad to help." David Reed folded his arms loosely across his chest and looked again at the small boy sleeping peacefully. "Everything all right during the flight?" he asked his daughter. Imani hesitated only a second before replying. "The flight was fine, but something unexpected happened at the gate before we left the airport." Linda's expression sharpened slightly with quiet concern. "Unexpected?" Imani nodded slowly, then looked toward Graham. The moment had arrived whether any of them were fully prepared for it or not. She spoke calmly, her voice steady despite the significance of the words. "Mom, Dad, this is Noah's father." The silence that followed felt deeper than the echo of the parking structure around them. David Reed's eyes moved from his daughter to the sleeping child and then back to Graham. Linda's hand rose slowly to her mouth as the realization settled in. For Graham Whitaker, the world of boardrooms and corporate negotiations suddenly felt very far away. Standing beneath the fluorescent lights of a quiet parking garage, he understood that the most important introductions of his life had just begun. The silence inside the parking structure lingered for several seconds after Imani's words settled into the cold evening air. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting pale reflections across the rows of parked cars. David Reed did not move at first. His eyes remained fixed on Graham Whitaker as though carefully measuring the man standing in front of him. Linda Reed lowered her hand slowly from her mouth, her gaze shifting between her daughter, the sleeping toddler, and the stranger who had just been introduced as Noah's father. Graham felt the weight of their attention immediately. In the world he usually occupied, introductions were brief and formal. A handshake, a title, a polite exchange before moving on to business. But this moment carried none of that familiar structure. This introduction held years of absence, questions that had not yet been spoken, and the quiet presence of a sleeping child who represented all of it. David Reed finally exhaled slowly and glanced down at Noah. The toddler remained asleep against Imani's shoulder, unaware that the adults around him had just entered a conversation that would shape the rest of his life. David studied the child's face for a moment, then looked back at Graham again. The older man's voice was calm, but steady when he spoke. "You just found this out tonight?" Graham nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." At the gate inside the terminal. David's eyebrows lifted slightly, absorbing the information. That must have been quite a conversation. Graham allowed a small, honest breath to leave his chest. It was. Linda Reed stepped a little closer to Imani and gently touched Noah's back, her expression softening again when she felt the steady rhythm of the child's breathing. "Poor little traveler," she murmured quietly. "He does not know his evening has become a family story already." Imani gave a faint smile at that, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "He was brave about the delay," she said. "Just tired." Linda nodded and then turned her attention toward Graham again. Unlike her husband's careful reserve, her expression carried a different kind of curiosity. "And you stayed after learning the truth?" she asked gently. "You did not leave on your flight?" Graham shook his head. "No, ma'am." He glanced briefly toward the airport terminal behind them, where the glow of the glass doors reflected against the pavement. "I decided that leaving immediately would not have been the right choice." David Reed considered the answer quietly. His posture remained straight, the stance of a man who had spent decades standing in classrooms explaining difficult subjects to teenagers who often tested his patience. Finally, he nodded once. "Fair enough," he said. "Life has a way of changing plans when you least expect it." Graham recognized the thoughtful acceptance behind the words, though the older man's eyes still held careful caution. David looked toward Imani next. "How did this all unfold?" he asked his daughter. Imani shifted Noah slightly in her arms, so his head rested more comfortably against her shoulder. The boy murmured softly in his sleep, but did not wake. Noah started crying during the delay at the gate, she explained. Graham helped calm him down. When Noah looked up at him, she paused briefly before finishing the sentence. The resemblance made the truth impossible to ignore. Linda Reed studied Graham's face more closely now, her gaze moving between him and the child again. After a moment, she nodded slowly, clearly noticing the same similarities that had startled Graham earlier in the evening. I see it, she said quietly. David glanced once more at Noah, before returning his attention to Graham. And what happens now? He asked. The question was not aggressive or accusatory. It was simply direct, the kind of question a teacher might ask when expecting a thoughtful answer. Graham took a moment before responding. Tonight, I wanted to meet the people who have been part of Noah's life, he said honestly. And tomorrow I would like to begin figuring out how I can become part of it as well. David's expression remained neutral, though something thoughtful moved behind his eyes. That sounds reasonable, he said slowly. But becoming part of a child's life takes more than good intentions. Graham nodded immediately. I understand that. Linda stepped closer and gently adjusted the blanket around Noah's legs. The grandmotherly gesture carried quiet familiarity, the same kind of care Imani had shown earlier in the terminal. We have spent the last 2 years helping our daughter raise this little boy, she said softly. We will always protect what is best for him. Graham met her eyes calmly. I would expect nothing less. The sincerity in his voice seemed to settle something in the air between them. David Reed studied him for another long moment before finally nodding again. Well, he said, standing in a parking garage is not the best place to talk through a life-changing evening. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Why do not we start with something simpler? You look like a man who has had a long day. Have you eaten dinner yet? The question caught Graham slightly off guard. No, sir, he admitted. David gestured toward the blue sedan behind him. Then perhaps the 4 of us can find a late-night diner on the way out of the city. Noah will sleep through it anyway. Linda chuckled softly. He sleeps like a rock once he settles. Imani glanced at Graham, silently offering him the choice. Graham looked down at the sleeping child one more time before answering. I would like that, he said quietly. For the first time since the introduction in the parking garage, the tension in the air eased slightly. The Reed family began preparing the car for the drive, unaware that the quiet dinner they were about to share would become the first chapter of a much larger story for the man who had just discovered he was Noah's father. The cool air inside the parking structure followed them as David Reed opened the trunk of the blue sedan and carefully placed the travel bag inside. The metal lid closed with a quiet click that echoed faintly against the concrete pillars. For a moment, the 4 adults stood beside the car beneath the pale fluorescent lights, the quiet rhythm of the late evening airport surrounding them. Noah remained asleep in Imani's arms, his small body completely relaxed now that the long day of travel had finally ended. Graham Whitaker noticed how naturally the Reed family moved around one another. Linda stepped to the passenger side and opened the back door without needing to ask. Imani leaned down and gently settled Noah into the car seat that had already been installed behind the front passenger seat. The toddler stirred slightly as his jacket brushed against the soft fabric of the seat, but did not wake. His head tilted to the side and rested comfortably against the padded support as his breathing continued in the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep. Linda carefully adjusted the small blanket around his legs and tucked the edges so the cool night air would not reach him. The movement carried the quiet confidence of a grandmother who had performed this small act countless times. Graham watched the scene with quiet attention. It was a simple moment, but it revealed something important about the world Noah had grown up in. This child had never been alone. He had been surrounded by people who protected his comfort and watched over every small detail of his day. David closed the trunk and walked around to the driver's side door. Before opening it, he paused and glanced toward Graham. You riding with us? He asked calmly. Graham nodded without hesitation. If that is all right with you. David gave a small approving nod. Then hop in. Graham moved to the back seat on the opposite side of Noah's car seat, while Imani settled into the seat beside her sleeping son. Linda took the front passenger seat and David started the engine. The quiet hum of the car filled the space as the heater began to push warm air through the vents. Outside the parking garage exit, the city lights stretched into the distance, the highways weaving through the night like bright ribbons across the dark landscape. As they pulled out of the structure and joined the slow stream of cars leaving the airport, the moment settled into a quieter rhythm. For several minutes no one spoke. The soft sound of the tires moving across the road and the steady breathing of the sleeping toddler created a calm silence that felt almost reflective. Graham looked out the window at the passing lights of Chicago. The skyline shimmered in the distance, a familiar symbol of business deals and corporate negotiations. Yet tonight it felt like a different city entirely. Linda eventually turned slightly in her seat to glance back toward the rear of the car. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. "Noah usually wakes up if the car stops too often," she said quietly. "But if the ride stays smooth, he will sleep all the way home." Imani nodded. "He always has." Graham leaned slightly forward, looking at the child through the dim interior light of the car. Noah's small chest rose and fell slowly beneath the blanket. Every now and then the toddler's fingers twitched slightly, as if he were still exploring the world in a dream. Graham felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility settle quietly in his thoughts. This was no longer an abstract idea or a surprising conversation at an airport gate. The child sleeping beside him was real. His son, David, guided the sedan onto the highway ramp leading north out of the city. The steady flow of traffic carried them toward the dark stretch of road that would eventually lead to Milwaukee. After a few minutes, David spoke without taking his eyes off the road. "So tell me something, Graham." His voice remained calm but thoughtful. "What exactly do you do for a living?" Graham gave a small breath of amusement at the straightforward question. "I run a technology company," he replied. "Whitaker Dynamics." David nodded slowly. "I have heard the name." Linda glanced back again with a hint of curiosity. "You build software, correct?" Graham nodded. "Mostly data systems that help large companies organize logistics and supply chains." Linda smiled faintly. "That explains the headlines I have seen online." David's voice carried a thoughtful tone as he continued driving. "A business like that must demand a lot of your time." Graham did not try to avoid the truth. "It does." The older man nodded again. "Then the question I asked earlier still stands." Graham understood immediately. "What happens now?" he said quietly. David's eyes remained on the road ahead, the headlights of passing cars reflecting across the windshield. "Exactly." Graham looked once more at the sleeping child beside him before answering. "Now I begin learning how to make room in my life for the responsibilities I did not know existed until tonight." The answer hung in the warm air inside the car. Linda studied his expression carefully through the rearview mirror. David drove for another mile in thoughtful silence before speaking again. "That sounds like the right direction," he said calmly. "Just remember that children notice actions much more than words." Graham nodded slowly. "I intend to remember that." The highway stretched forward beneath the glow of distant streetlights as the car continued north through the night, carrying 4 adults and 1 sleeping child toward a future none of them had expected when the evening began. The highway stretched forward beneath a wide canopy of night sky as David Reed guided the blue sedan steadily north toward Milwaukee. The city lights of Chicago slowly faded behind them, replaced by the long, quiet rhythm of interstate travel. The dashboard glowed softly in shades of blue and amber while the heater hummed gently through the car vents, keeping the interior warm against the cold November air outside. In the back seat, Noah remained fast asleep in his car seat, his small head tilted slightly to one side, while the steady movement of the vehicle carried him deeper into rest. Imani watched him quietly for a few moments, adjusting the blanket once more when it slipped from his shoulder. The soft fabric brushed against his chin, but he did not wake. After 2 years of caring for him, she understood every small signal of his sleep patterns, and tonight he had clearly reached the deep calm that came after a long day of excitement. Graham Whitaker sat on the opposite side of the back seat, observing the small details of the scene with thoughtful attention. The glow of passing highway lights moved rhythmically across Noah's face every few seconds, illuminating the familiar curve of the boy's brow and the gentle rise and fall of his chest beneath the blanket. Earlier that evening, Graham had believed his most important responsibility was reaching a meeting on the West Coast by morning. Now he sat quietly beside a sleeping child whose presence had reshaped the entire direction of his thoughts. In the front seat, Linda Reed turned slightly, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the dashboard lights as she looked toward the back of the car. "He will probably sleep another hour at least," she said gently. "Long car rides always make him comfortable." Imani nodded. "He slept almost the entire drive back from Michigan last summer." Linda smiled faintly at the memory. "Yes, he did." The conversation settled again into a comfortable quiet. Outside the windows, the dark outlines of trees and distant highway signs slid past under the steady beam of the headlights. After several miles, David spoke again, without turning his head. "Graham," he said calmly, "I have spent most of my life teaching teenagers how to think carefully before making big decisions." His voice carried the thoughtful patience of a man used to guiding difficult conversations. "So I hope you do not mind if I ask another question." Graham leaned slightly forward in his seat. "Please do." David nodded once. "What kind of childhood did you have?" The question seemed simple, but it carried a quiet weight that Graham immediately recognized. This was not about curiosity. It was about understanding the kind of man who might now become part of Noah's life. Graham considered the answer carefully before speaking. "My parents lived in Ohio when I was growing up," he began. "My father was an electrical engineer, and my mother taught piano lessons from our home. We did not have much money when I was young, but they believed strongly in education and discipline." Linda listened with interest as the highway stretched ahead of them. "Did they support your interest in technology?" she asked. Graham nodded. "My father did. He gave me my first computer when I was 12 years old. It was an old machine from the company where he worked. I spent hours learning how it functioned." David gave a small approving nod. "Curiosity is a powerful teacher." Graham continued quietly. "I built my first small software program during my freshman year of college. A few friends helped me turn it into a service that businesses could use. That project eventually grew into the company I run today." The explanation was simple, but it carried years of effort and ambition within it. Linda studied him thoughtfully through the rearview mirror. "Building something like that takes dedication," she said. Graham gave a faint smile. "It does. Sometimes more dedication than I realized at the time." Imani glanced toward him briefly. She understood the deeper meaning behind those words. Building a company had demanded years of focus that left little room for anything else. David kept his eyes on the highway, the steady lines of the road guiding the car through the quiet darkness. "And now you have learned that life built something else while you were busy building your company," he said calmly. Graham nodded. "Yes." The older man considered that for a moment. "Life does that sometimes," David said quietly. "It places responsibilities in front of us that we did not plan for but cannot ignore." Graham looked once more at Noah's sleeping face. "I am beginning to understand that tonight." The highway sign ahead announced the next major exit toward the northern suburbs. The sedan moved smoothly beneath it as the miles continued to pass. Linda turned slightly again so she could see the child more clearly. "He has a gentle personality," she said softly. "Even when he is curious, he watches people carefully before trusting them." Graham nodded slowly. "I noticed that earlier." Imani glanced toward her son with quiet affection. "Once he trusts someone, he remembers them." The statement lingered in the air between them. Graham understood the quiet promise within those words. Trust could grow, but it could also disappear if it was not respected. David eventually broke the silence again as the car passed another cluster of highway lights. "We will reach the diner in about 15 minutes, he said. "It is a small place we have stopped at for years during late drives." Linda smiled faintly. "They make excellent coffee." Graham looked out the window for a moment, watching the highway stretch forward beneath the steady rhythm of passing lights. Then his gaze returned to the child sleeping beside him. For the first time since discovering the truth inside the airport terminal, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt like a long road unfolding 1 mile at a time, and tonight he had already begun the journey. The highway exit sign appeared ahead beneath the glow of tall streetlights, its green reflective surface announcing a small town just beyond the edge of the interstate. David Reed slowed the blue sedan and guided it gently onto the exit ramp. The steady rhythm of the highway faded into the quieter pace of local roads, where scattered businesses and gas stations sat beneath pools of yellow light against the dark November sky. Inside the car, the warmth from the heater continued to circulate softly, keeping the interior comfortable while the outside air carried the crisp chill of approaching winter. Noah remained deeply asleep in his car seat, the blanket still tucked carefully around his legs. Every few minutes his small hand twitched slightly, as if he were still reaching for something in a dream. Graham Whitaker watched the tiny motion with quiet fascination. The presence of the child beside him had begun to feel strangely natural, even though only a few hours earlier he had not known Noah existed. The sedan turned onto a smaller road lined with low buildings and quiet parking lots. Ahead, a warm neon sign glowed above the entrance to a diner that looked like it had been standing there for decades. The red letters reflected faintly against the damp pavement as David pulled the car slowly into the nearly empty parking lot. Only 3 other vehicles sat beneath the street lamps, suggesting the late hour had already thinned the evening crowd. David parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. For a moment no one moved. The quiet hum of the heater faded gradually while the silence of the night settled around them. Linda turned slightly in her seat and looked back at the sleeping child. "He is still completely out," she said gently. Imani glanced down at Noah and nodded. "He will not wake unless we move him too quickly." David opened his door and stepped out into the cool air. Graham followed a second later, the chill of the night brushing against his face as he closed the car door quietly behind him. Imani carefully lifted Noah from the car seat, supporting his head against her shoulder the way she had done countless times before. The toddler stirred slightly but remained asleep, his small arm draping loosely across her shoulder. Linda wrapped the blanket a little tighter around him before they walked toward the diner entrance together. Inside the building, the warm scent of coffee and grilled food filled the air immediately. The interior lights glowed softly against polished countertops and red vinyl booths that lined the walls. A small radio behind the counter played a quiet country song, while a waitress wiped down a nearby table. She looked up with a friendly smile when the group entered. "Evening, folks," she said warmly. "Pick any booth you like." David nodded politely and guided them toward a booth near the window where the soft yellow light created a comfortable space away from the empty counter area. Imani slid into the booth first so she could carefully settle Noah against her shoulder without waking him. The toddler's breathing remained slow, and even as he continued sleeping through the movement. Graham sat across from her while David and Linda took the seats beside him. The waitress returned a moment later with menus and 4 glasses of water. "Coffee?" she asked. Linda smiled. "Yes, please." David nodded as well. Graham ordered coffee and a simple sandwich while Imani requested tea. The waitress scribbled down the order and disappeared toward the kitchen. For a moment the group sat quietly beneath the soft glow of the overhead lights. Outside the window, the parking lot remained still beneath the night sky. Finally, Linda leaned forward slightly and folded her hands on the table. Her voice carried a thoughtful warmth when she spoke. "Well," she said gently, "this may not be the most traditional way for families to meet." A faint smile touched Imani's face. "No, it is not." Graham gave a quiet breath of agreement. "Tonight has been full of surprises." David rested his hands calmly on the table and studied Graham with the steady patience of a lifelong teacher. "Surprises have a way of revealing character," he said. "They show how people respond when life does not follow the plan they expected." Graham met his gaze respectfully. "I suppose tonight is giving me that opportunity." The older man nodded slowly. "It is." The waitress returned with coffee and tea, placing the steaming cups carefully on the table before leaving them again. The warm aroma of fresh coffee filled the small space of the booth. Graham wrapped his hands loosely around the mug, feeling the heat through the ceramic as he considered everything that had happened since stepping into the airport earlier that evening. Across from him, Noah shifted slightly in his sleep, his small head resting comfortably against Imani's shoulder. The resemblance between them remained unmistakable even beneath the soft diner lights. Linda noticed Graham watching the child and spoke gently. "He looks peaceful when he sleeps," she said. "He always has." Graham nodded. "He does." David took a sip of his coffee before speaking again. "You mentioned earlier that you want to begin learning how to be part of his life." Graham set the mug back onto the table. "Yes." David leaned back slightly in the booth. "Then tonight is simply the first step. Tomorrow will bring many more." Graham understood the meaning behind the statement. Becoming part of Noah's life would require patience, effort, and time. It would not happen in a single conversation or a late-night meeting in a roadside diner. Yet as he looked again at the sleeping child resting safely in Imani's arms, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the beginning of a responsibility he was ready to accept. The quiet hum of the diner wrapped gently around the booth as the small group settled into the warmth of the late-night meal. Outside the wide window, the parking lot remained still beneath the pale glow of the streetlights, while inside the soft clink of dishes and the faint sound of the radio created a calm atmosphere that felt far removed from the busy airport they had left behind. The waitress returned with a tray and carefully placed a sandwich in front of Graham, a bowl of soup for David, a plate of eggs and toast for Linda, and a cup of warm tea beside Imani. The aroma of fresh food drifted through the air, adding a comforting sense of normalcy to an evening that had begun with unexpected revelations. Imani remained seated with Noah resting against her shoulder, the toddler still fast asleep, as though the quiet warmth of the diner had become another extension of his home. His small hand lay loosely against the sleeve of her coat, and every few moments his fingers curled gently before relaxing again. Graham noticed the movement and found himself studying the small details of the boy's face beneath the soft yellow diner lights. The resemblance that had first startled him in the airport terminal felt even clearer now. The curve of the eyebrows, the shape of the nose, even the slight crease that formed on Noah's forehead when he shifted in his sleep mirrored features Graham had seen in the mirror for most of his life. Linda Reed followed his gaze and spoke softly so as not to disturb the child. "He always falls asleep like this when he has had a long day," she said. "Once he is comfortable, he could sleep through almost anything." Graham nodded quietly. "He seems peaceful." David lifted his coffee cup and took a slow sip before speaking. "Children tend to feel safe when the people around them are calm," he said. "They notice more than adults realize." Graham understood the deeper meaning behind the statement. Noah's sense of safety had been built by the people who had been present in his life every day since he was born. Imani glanced toward her father with a faint, knowing smile. "He is right about that," she said gently. The waitress returned briefly to refill the coffee cups and then moved away again, leaving the group in a quiet moment of reflection. Graham finally took a bite of his sandwich, realizing only then how long it had been since he had eaten. The simple food tasted surprisingly satisfying after the long evening. Across the table, Linda watched him thoughtfully. "You must be wondering how quickly life can change," she said kindly. Graham gave a small breath of agreement. "Earlier today, I believe my biggest concern was a meeting on the West Coast. Now I am sitting in a diner learning about my son." Linda smiled warmly. "Life does not always send invitations before it changes direction." David leaned slightly forward with his hands resting around his coffee mug. "What matters most is how people respond when that change arrives," he said. Graham met his gaze respectfully. "I understand that." Imani studied him for a moment before speaking. "You will have many chances to prove it," she said calmly. Her tone was not harsh or skeptical. It simply carried the honesty of someone who had learned through experience that trust grows slowly. Graham nodded. "I expect that." Noah shifted slightly again and released a soft breath against Imani's shoulder. She adjusted her position so his head remained supported, gently brushing one hand across his back in a quiet, soothing motion. The movement was instinctive and effortless. Graham watched carefully, noticing the calm patience in the way she cared for the child. For 2 years, she had been the center of Noah's world. That reality was something Graham knew he could never rewrite or replace. But perhaps he could learn how to become part of it. After a moment, David spoke again. "You mentioned earlier that your work keeps you busy," he said. "Where do you live?" "Seattle," Graham answered. "That is where my company headquarters is located." Linda raised her eyebrows slightly. "That is quite a distance from Milwaukee." Graham nodded. "It is." The older couple exchanged a quick, thoughtful glance. David rested his hands together again before continuing. "Distance does not make responsibility impossible," he said calmly. "But it does require effort." Graham understood the meaning immediately. "I am prepared to travel as often as necessary," he said. "And I can arrange for work flexibility when needed." Imani listened quietly, her eyes focused on Noah as he slept. After a moment, she looked back toward Graham. "We will figure out what is best for him step by step," she said. Graham accepted the careful pace without hesitation. "That sounds right." The waitress returned once more with a small bowl of warm water and lemon slices, placing it beside Linda with a friendly nod. The diner had grown even quieter as the hour moved deeper into the night. Outside the window, a light wind moved across the empty parking lot, stirring fallen leaves beneath the street lamps. Inside the booth, the four adults sat together in a moment that felt strangely peaceful despite the magnitude of what had unfolded during the evening. Graham looked once more at the sleeping child resting safely in his mother's arms. Just hours earlier, Noah had been a stranger crying in an airport terminal. Now he was the center of a future Graham had only begun to understand. And as the warm light of the diner reflected softly across the table, Graham Whitaker realized that the most important chapter of his life had quietly begun. The warmth of the diner lingered around the small booth as the last of the coffee cooled in the cups, and the quiet rhythm of the night deepened outside the windows. The radio behind the counter had switched to a slower song, and the waitress moved calmly between empty tables with a cloth in her hand, wiping the surfaces with the unhurried pace of someone accustomed to the quiet hours after midnight. Inside the booth, Noah remained asleep against Imani's shoulder, his breathing steady and peaceful, as though the long evening had finally carried him into a place where nothing could disturb his rest. Graham Whitaker watched the small rise and fall of the child's chest for several seconds before slowly lifting his gaze toward the others at the table. The conversation had softened into thoughtful silence after hours of unexpected truth, but the silence itself now felt comfortable rather than uncertain. David Reed eventually leaned back in his seat and folded his hands loosely across his chest. His eyes moved between Graham and his daughter with the careful patience that had guided his career as a teacher for many years. "Well," he said calmly, "it seems this evening has given all of us something to think about." Linda gave a gentle nod beside him. "It certainly has." Imani shifted slightly in her seat, so Noah's head rested more comfortably against her shoulder. The toddler murmured quietly in his sleep and then settled again, his small fingers closing softly around the fabric of her sleeve. Graham noticed the movement and felt a quiet sense of responsibility deepen inside his thoughts. Earlier that day, he had been planning a presentation for investors on the other side of the country. Now he sat in a small roadside diner with the family of a child who carried his eyes and his future. David reached for his coffee cup one last time before setting it carefully back onto the table. "Graham," he said thoughtfully, "there are moments in life when a man has the opportunity to choose the direction of his character." Graham listened closely. "Tonight is one of those moments for you." Graham nodded slowly, accepting the truth of the words. "I know." David continued in the same calm tone. "You did not know about Noah before this evening. That much is clear. But now that you do know, the path forward becomes a matter of choice." Linda glanced gently toward Noah before speaking. "Children do not need perfection," she said softly. "They need people who care enough to stay present." Graham took a quiet breath. The weight of their words did not feel like pressure. Instead, it felt like guidance from people who had already proven their commitment to the child sleeping beside them. "I understand," he said, "and I intend to remain present." Imani watched him carefully for a moment before speaking again. Her voice carried the calm strength that had defined her throughout the evening. "What matters most is stability," she said. "Noah has a routine. He knows where he wakes up every morning and who will be there to greet him." Graham nodded. "I would never want to disrupt that." She studied his expression, measuring the sincerity behind the statement. "Then we take this one step at a time," she said. Graham gave a small, respectful nod. "One step at a time." Outside the diner window, the wind moved softly across the empty parking lot, stirring a few dry leaves that rolled quietly along the pavement beneath the streetlights. Inside the warm booth, the conversation had settled into a quiet understanding that none of them had expected when the night began. Linda eventually smiled gently and reached for the bill the waitress had left on the table. "This one is ours," she said warmly before anyone else could reach for it. David chuckled softly. "A teacher's salary may not match a technology company, but we can still buy dinner." Graham smiled with quiet appreciation. "Thank you." The group slowly gathered their coats as the evening drew toward its natural conclusion. Imani carefully stood while keeping Noah supported against her shoulder. The child stirred briefly but did not wake, his head resting comfortably beneath the warmth of the blanket wrapped around him. Graham stood as well and held the door open as they stepped back into the cool night air outside the diner. The cold breeze carried the quiet scent of autumn across the empty lot, while the distant highway hummed softly somewhere beyond the trees. David unlocked the sedan and opened the rear door so Imani could place Noah gently back into the car seat. The toddler shifted slightly but remained asleep, his small hand resting loosely against the blanket once more. Linda adjusted the fabric around his shoulders before closing the door quietly. Graham paused beside the car for a moment, looking through the window at the peaceful child who had unknowingly changed the direction of his life. David stepped beside him and followed his gaze. A long road begins with small steps, the older man said quietly. Graham nodded. Then tonight was the first one. The car doors closed softly as they prepared to continue the drive north toward Milwaukee. The highway lights waited in the distance, stretching forward into the dark horizon. And as Graham Whitaker climbed into the back seat beside the sleeping boy, he understood with quiet certainty that the future ahead of him was no longer measured only by business deals or corporate plans. It was measured by the promise he had just begun to keep.